Hi, welcome to the DeepFake Dialogues. My guest today is Riana Pfefferkorn, a policy fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI. Riana is a lawyer who spent years working on encryption, surveillance, and digital civil liberties at Stanford's Internet Observatory and the Center for Internet and Society. And her work now focuses on the use of nudify apps and image generators to create sexual images of children. In July of 2025, she published a HAI policy brief titled Addressing AI-Generated Child Sexual Abuse Material, Opportunities for Educational Policy, drawing on stakeholder interviews from educators, platforms, law enforcement, legislators, and victims themselves. We'll be discussing the contents of this brief in more detail today. Let's dive in. Riana, thank you so much for joining me today. So I want to start with the conceptual groundwork from your HAI brief, because the language that we use here actually matters quite a lot. And your brief uses the term AI-generated child sexual abuse material, or AI-CSAM, as the umbrella. And within that umbrella, you draw an important distinction between material depicting children who don't exist in real life and material depicting real identifiable children. So can you walk us through that distinction and why it matters, both legally and in terms of harm?
Sure. So I think it's important because possibly the first thing that might come to mind if people hear AI generated, they might just be thinking, oh, this is completely made up. It doesn't depict anybody who really exists. They've probably seen plenty of pictures of just completely fully like AI generated images, whether they're realistic looking or not. But what we actually see in a lot of the cases that I've been tracking is that very often these situations where people get arrested or where children are caught making deepfake nudes is that they're doing it of like real kids who actually exist. Maybe it's a child celebrity or an influencer. Maybe it's somebody known to the person. For example, there are sometimes teachers who get arrested, and it might be some of their students. And in the case of student-on-student incidents, it's somebody else in their class or somebody else in school. So it matters as a legal matter because a couple of years into the 21st century, the Supreme Court here in the United States ruled that fully virtual, to use their term, CSAM, short for child sex abuse imagery, is constitutionally protected speech because the rationale for saying that CSAM has no First Amendment protection as free speech, unlike most categories of speech out there, is that it is inextricable from the harm being committed upon the child who's being depicted. And so the Supreme Court's rationale in this 2002 case was to say, well, that rationale is absent where we're talking about fully virtual material. And at that time, the state of the art might have been Photoshop or something similar, but the Department of Justice and Congress, in enacting a law outlawing even fully virtual material, was thinking, well, there might be technological tools that will make it hard to tell a real person apart from a fully digital depiction. And so the Supreme Court said this is protected speech so long as it is fully virtual. And also so long, I'll add, as it is not obscene, because obscenity is also a separate category of unprotected speech under the First Amendment. So they were talking about the narrow, probably very narrow category of material that doesn't count as obscene, but they were addressing only the child rationale there. So I draw that distinction in the paper because that is a major ramification for the legality of the speech being discussed in any particular incident. And then in terms of the harm, likewise, a lot of the arguments that we see now over whether to ban fully virtual imagery are the same arguments that were raised by the government and shot down in the Supreme Court's case, which did not deal with imagery, so-called morphed imagery, where a real child's image is altered to depict them in a sexually explicit pose. The Supreme Court was only dealing with fully virtual material. But all the sorts of harms that the court said, well, those just don't apply when we're talking about there's no real kid present. Those do apply when you are talking about a real child. It is closer to a depiction of a real child being abused that is recorded, an actual depiction of abuse that actually happened, and that there is a real kid who will suffer the psychological toll of being depicted in a morphed image, may have the reputational harms or fears of reputational harms. There is a real impact on a real kid. And so for that reason, while the Supreme Court has never squarely addressed the First Amendment coverage of what we call morphed images, a number of courts of appeals have, and they've pretty much all said this is, harmful to the child, and therefore it is more akin to like actual depictions of abuse than it is to fully virtual, made-up children.
And to clarify, so morphed imagery would include like deepfake nudes created through nudify apps.
That's right. So
Okay.
we, back when the court was, ruling on, sorry, well, to back up, back when Congress was defining these categories and saying, morphed images are one of the categories of what gets defined as child pornography, to use the term that's still on the books federally. Again, we're talking about a much different era of technology where it probably required some amount of technical skill to use a graphics editing software in order to create one of those images. Now you can morph an image just by uploading something into a Nudify app. That's right.
And so focusing on that second category of real identifiable children. So we're seeing an increase in students using Nudify and face swap apps and websites on their classmates. So can you just talk about who's doing this, and to whom, and what are these apps making possible that wasn't possible before?
The general like fact pattern is mostly boy making imagery of one or more girls, somebody else in their class, in their school. We've seen it by kids as young as 13 or 14 making imagery of kids as young as 11 or 12. But, my sense is that it's mostly a high school and to some extent middle school phenomenon, mostly boys making images of girls. The one place where that gets inverted is where boys are more likely to be the target is the so-called sextortion fact pattern, where criminal scammers, usually located outside of the United States, find a kid's image, and now they can nudify it directly. Previously, if they wanted to sextort somebody, they would have had to pose as somebody, as a potential romantic interest, fool the kid into sending them a nude, and then use that to extort money out of them. Now they can just take a picture of somebody, nudify it, and then directly start extorting the kid. That's the one context where it is more common for boys to be the victims than girls. But for student-on-student incidents, it is usually boy on girl. We don't have a lot of statistical details collectively about these incidents so far, both because it's hard to find out conclusively about all of the incidents that are out there around the United States, because sometimes these things may get resolved without reporting to outside authorities, and therefore they don't hit the local news, for example, but also because student privacy laws quite rightly make it hard to find out a lot of information about these incidents, or in the rare instances we've seen where there are juvenile court proceedings against the offender. Again, those proceedings are typically very heavily sealed and not open to the public the way most court proceedings are. So we don't have a good sense, beyond sort of the general like genders of the parties involved, anything about the socioeconomic makeup, who's more likely to offend, who's more likely to be victimized. Are LGBTQ kids at more risk, as they are for so many other types of harm? Are there any like racial or ethnic categories for like who's more likely to be victimized, etc.? All of which I think, if we had more information, would better enable us to do something about figuring out how best to address these issues, or how to address them in a more sensitive way that both favors trying to do some sort of reconstructive, restorative justice for the offenders, as well as better victim support. Because right now it seems like we're still in very early days, where if they have any idea that this is an issue at all, there are only so many school districts and schools that are proactively trying to deal with this as a problem. So thus far, we don't, like I said, necessarily have a really great detailed picture of exactly how this problem is showing up in schools. It does seem to happen where kids are either getting exposed to this by knowing that they exist and they search for it, and a lot of search results will still come up for these, even though search engines are trying to fight it. Or they may have an ad show up to them while they're on some other app advertising a nudify or face swapping app, even though, again, these sorts of ads are forbidden on most advertising policies for most ad networks. But it's such a whack-a-mole game that these things can get through. Or one other problem with these sorts of nudify apps is that they misrepresent the true extent of their capabilities. And so the ads that they submit may not show the ability to nudify somebody's image. Or similarly, when they are submitted for App Store review, they may slip through App Store review, likewise by misrepresenting the full extent of their functionality. And so even if, the app stores, ad networks, et cetera, have policies against these, a lot of them do still slip through. And so a kid may see an ad for those apps. Even if they do ultimately get banned from the app stores, they get caught. Some of these don't require a downloadable app to work. Some of them are website based. So unless and until the website itself gets filtered out or whatever, kids may still be able to visit the website, even if whether or not they are not downloading an app for local use on their phone. And then all it takes is the ability to pull somebody's image from whatever source. It could be somebody's social media account, could be their parents' social media account, because parents upload pictures of their kids. It might be a website run by a sports team the kid is on, or a school team, or some other school yearbook, something like that. There are plenty of places to get pictures of somebody. And of course, we're all carrying around cameras in our pockets. And so kids can also take pictures of the person that they want to nudify in person, and then use the image that they personally took in order to undress that person.
Yeah, and your HAI report makes an argument about how when schools are caught unprepared by a deepfake nude incident, their response can actually deepen the harm to the victim. So what does a botched response typically look like, and what's the pattern that you keep seeing here?
We've definitely seen that schools tend to be in reaction mode, and they don't have a plan in place that they could resort to that would guide them in how to respond properly. Sometimes there is such a focus on trying to sniff out the offender and figure out what to do about the offender that the victim kind of may fall by the wayside and not receive proper victim support. Schools may just be kind of caught by surprise and not exactly know what to do, and so they may make potentially well-meaning but insensitive or inappropriate comments to the victim. I haven't necessarily seen this specifically in my own research, but we've seen instances where adults who are victimized by deepfake nudes get victim blamed. Like, oh, it's your fault because you have a social media account with pictures of yourself. You're so vain and, and selfish that this led to your own harm. And so that's also a possible response. Although, again, it's not something that I've necessarily seen documented. Although there is one instance, I think out of Louisiana, where a kid who had been nudified by one of the boys in her school, she took matters into her own hands and beat that kid up, and she was the one who ended up getting disciplined by the school rather than him. So that's another instance of maybe a misplaced focus on where and how to respond. One thing that did emerge from the research that we were doing, which combined both interviews with people, a range of stakeholders, including some victims, parents, lawyers, as well as getting public records request responses back from school districts that had been in the news for having these incidents, was that I noticed that there was a pattern where teachers and counselors, so the people at a school who are closest to the kids, tended to respond better, more supportively, more like victim-centered, like trying to create safe spaces, trying to make sure that they were available for the victims, compared with administrators who may have been more focused on, okay, what do we say to the school? We need to draft up a note that will go out to the school, after being sometimes pushed to say anything at all. So that can be a potential difference, is that the way that a school administration is responding may be different from the possibly very correct instincts that teachers and counselors who work with kids every day have, that can potentially be more victim-oriented, more support-oriented, as opposed to what are our legal obligations? How do we make sure that, I think that schools are concerned that they themselves may face some potential liability, or focusing so much, like I said, on like, how do we figure out who is responsible here and discipline those kids, that the victim may feel a little bit forgotten.
So, what do you think that a school that's ready and prepared to face this issue, like what would they have in place before an incident like this occurs?
It's a great question, and I'm not like an educational policy expert, and
Yeah.
so I don't want to say what I think is exactly the right thing to do. But at minimum, I think it would be useful to have a policy in place, have all of the people at the school be trained on the capacity for AI to be used to nudify images and that these apps exist. Make sure that there is a plan for how to investigate and document imagery, because we've also found that there have been some instances where schools said that their hands were tied in terms of discipline because kids delete the images from their phones, and so there isn't evidence. How do you notify the parents? How do you bring in the potential victims and the potential offenders? Because one of the other things we've heard where a matter was not necessarily handled super sensitively was that the boys who were accused were allowed to be sort of like taken quietly aside to get a talking to and talk to the school leadership, whereas the girls' names were announced over the PA for the entire school to hear. And so they were more like humiliated and shamed by having to do the walk to the principal's office, as opposed to keeping the names of the students who were accused of it much quieter. And so that's, another thing to have to plan is how to go about this in a sensitive way that nevertheless tries to document as much as possible early on. I would have counseling services available for students, make sure that the counselors are aware of and have some idea of how to deal with this. Even like ways for making sure that everybody involved gets protected from any kind of retaliation, whether that's the kid for reporting what happened to her, or whether it's the victims themselves. We've seen instances where the families of the accused, of the offenders, were afraid that the offender was going to get beaten up at school or otherwise suffer some sort of harm. So you have to have plans for the safety of all of the kids involved. I think it's also useful to try and view this potentially through a cyberbullying lens. That's one of the suggestions that we heard for, like, well, how should schools be dealing with this? Schools already have to have a cyberbullying policy in place under most states' laws that say, like, schools have to have bullying plans and tells them specifically, like, here are what the disciplinary options are that are available to you. That's one approach. The other is that, this may qualify as an incident that has to be reported under what are called mandatory reporter laws, where if there are suspicions at a school that a child is being abused, including sexually abused, they have to report that to the proper authorities. Some state laws, it says call Child Protective Services. Some states, it says call the local law enforcement agency. And that's been a source of a lot of confusion with early incidents of deepfake nudes being committed by one student against another student, because it wasn't necessarily clear under the state's law whether that covers these sorts of incidents where nobody ever lays a finger on the victim necessarily. So is that a category of what counts as sexual abuse? Is not. So that's something where, states, I think, now that a lot of them have made sure to clarify in their laws that AI-generated CSAM counts as CSAM and is illegal, they could also be clarifying their mandatory reporter laws one way or another, just to say, like, what are your obligations, so that schools aren't trying to figure out, in the heat of the moment and trying to call their outside counsel and say, what do we have to do here, so that everybody's ready one way or another. I do have my reservations about the mandatory reporter route because, like I said, like, this may lead to juvenile court proceedings if you are calling law enforcement. And I'm not convinced that that's the right strategy. I don't think criminalizing kids is necessarily going to be the answer here. So that's all responsive in terms of, like, what do you do, after the fact? In terms of preparation and trying to prevent this from happening in the first place, that was something where the people that we talked to were also very divided. In terms of what the right approach might be. Some were afraid that if you tell teenagers specifically, here's a thing that exists out there and it's bad and you should never go visit it and you should never use it, that might just attract them directly to go and try it out as a sort of normal curiosity and, like, bucking authority type thing for teenagers to do. I think my sense of that has been changed by the Grok scandal around the turn of the year, right at the dawn of 2026, where it was in the news that you could use, one of the biggest social media platforms in the world to put women and girls pictures into bikinis or worse than that. And so now I think the capacity for AI to undress people's images is now probably much more widespread knowledge than maybe it was when this was confined just to nudify apps that you either happened upon or maybe knew exist. So now I think it's probably changed my mind to think it's more appropriate for schools to directly engage with this when they're doing either their sex ed training or for kids, or whether it's part of bullying, lessons or whatever it might be. And then, even beyond that, one thing that I think there was more agreement on is that it is still appropriate just to make sure that kids are being taught about privacy, autonomy, personal dignity, the fact that somebody else's body and image belongs to them and not to you. And therefore and vice versa, that your body and your image are yours, and that it's not appropriate for other people to make sexualized images of you. And then that will equip kids to respond appropriately if and when they do find out about these apps. One of the things that I thought was most heartening about looking through the public records responses that we got was that we got investigative notes from one of the schools where one of these incidents had happened. And, according to these witness interviews, the kid who had nudified his classmates' images was, showing them around on his phone, like on the bus and at school. And all the other kids were like, dude, that's not okay. That's not cool. What are you doing? And so whether or not they had appropriate education or been taught specifically that these apps exist, they all reacted the way that we would want them to do. Like the kid who nudified other kids' images clearly didn't, but the kids he was trying to impress or should think that it was funny, whatever his goal was, they didn't go along with it. And so that's also, I think, important just to try and teach kids about consent, dignity, privacy, all of those things, so that they are better equipped. So those are some of the preventative and then, post-incident responses that I would suggest. One of the other things, finally, that we saw that was actually turned out to be really useful for these incidents in schools is that a lot of the times in many states, there are anonymous tip lines that exist primarily to report harassment and threats, intimidation. Maybe you saw somebody bring a gun in their backpack to campus, that kind of thing. And students were using that to report, hey, so-and-so took an image of such and such girls off of their Instagram and nudified it, and now he's spreading it around on Snapchat. And so if somebody didn't want to go directly, potentially be seen as a snitch, right, by going and talking to an adult at school or to their parent or whatever, they had this avenue by which they could bring it to the school's attention in an anonymous way. And so that's also something that I think, reminding students that no matter what it is, if something is wrong, if something is off, and you think we need to know about it, we should know about it, something is something bad is happening, this tip line exists, you can always use that.
Yeah. And I'm really glad that you brought up the curriculum integration point, because I think that's a really important discussion to have. I know that here in the UK, I'm currently in London, they've integrated a discussion about nudify apps and websites and deepfake sexual abuse into their RSHE statutory requirements for their relationship and health education, and so teachers are required to begin teaching that this fall. And I know, and I looked through what their curriculum has, and I think it makes clear that this is criminalized here in the UK, where publishing, even creating a nude image is a criminal offense here in the UK, which I don't think is true in the US yet. But I do think discussing the criminality of it does help with what you said about how this might inspire people to go and check these out, knowing that this is a criminal act could be a really good preventative measure where they understand the seriousness and the gravity of doing something like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. And like to clarify, federally, it has been a crime for 30 years to morph a real kid's image into a sexually explicit image. The gap that we found was that the states hadn't necessarily caught up and made sure that AI-generated imagery or computer-generated imagery of real kids was also banned under their state laws. And most of them have closed that gap. There's only a handful of states now that under state law haven't closed that gap yet. Federally, it has been illegal for a long time. With that said, the federal government doesn't generally prosecute minors. So if there's going to be any, resort under the law, under criminal law, it's going to come from the state level. Like I said, I'm not convinced that criminalizing kids is the right answer, but I think, the UK authorities are probably on the right track insofar as, one of the things that I've heard from researchers and that I've seen documented in some of the incidents that I've been studying is that like there has to be, you have to impress upon kids that there's consequences. Make sure that they know that it is illegal. And there's research showing that a significant percentage of kids have some hunch that this is probably illegal. Surely it must be. And it is increasingly true that it is illegal to nudify other kids' images federally and at the state level. So making them aware of that may be the thing that is needed to make the lesson stick. Even if, respect for others, yada, yada, doesn't stick, the possibility of getting in trouble might, even though, like I said, I don't think more kids being, treated as sex offenders for the rest of their lives is necessarily going to help anybody. One of the things that definitely has emerged from some of the more recent documentation that I've been reading, there was a very good in-depth news story in the Boston Globe out of Massachusetts relatively recently, which documented incident after incident in Massachusetts schools where it didn't seem like there were any consequences, or where schools, if they had a policy against nudifying other kids' images, which is, itself not guaranteed in a lot of schools yet, they weren't saying, dot, 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 and if you do this, here are the consequences that will happen to you, even if it's just school disciplinary consequences. So I think you're right that impressing upon kids not only that this is illegal, that is against school policy, and that there will be consequences if you do it, may be the thing that is needed to make sure that whatever a kid's personal opinion about the acceptability of doing this to other kids, that might be a deterrent away from this sort of behavior.
And so, expanding on the criminalization aspect, so your stance kind of puts you at odds with some advocates who want full criminal liability for student offenders. So, where do you draw the line between behavioral interventions and a criminal response?
So I think, at minimum, it is more appropriate to try and use behavioral interventions such as educational, training, or retraining, I guess, when like diversion programs, something to try and, you know, correct a kid's like attitude about this rather than just throwing the book at them to start with. And that's, not dissimilar from the sorts of developments that we've seen in other contexts, like drugs diversion, for example, right? To try and find some way to provide supportive help to correct the students' attitudes here rather than sending them straight through like the juvenile justice system. Or at minimum, making sure that, if they do go through the juvenile system, it is those sorts of, educational or rehabilitative type interventions that are the solution rather than going to juvenile hall. In terms of the criminalization, like if you look at the juvenile, like youth, like system, it is very traumatizing for the people who go through it. And so I've said before, I don't think the answer to traumatized kids is traumatizing more kids. And when we would talk to victim parents, they quite understandably want the book to be thrown at these kids who hurt their daughters, and would view the people who did it as like a monster, especially where it was somebody who had made images of multiple kids. But one of the things that we heard over and over again from the stakeholders that we talked to, cognitive scientists, educational experts, et cetera, was that a lot of kids, like their brains aren't fully developed yet. They're teenagers. Maybe they're even younger than that. They can't understand the consequences of their actions and think through them the way that an adult can. They may view making these sorts of images as a harmless prank. They may think it is funny. It may be a matter of curiosity. It may be a matter of fulfilling some sort of like sexual fantasy, which, there's normal sexual development. And you just need to, I think, still have some training to say, like, doesn't make image-based sexual abuse okay. But nevertheless, that it can run the gamut of different motivations for engaging in this behavior, well short of like monstrous criminal, like knowing misbehavior, which may be present in some instances. But it's why I am so hesitant about criminalization for kids is that you may have this real mismatch between what the kid's intent or lack thereof is and the harm that it does to the victim and what sort of consequences get visited upon them if they are criminalized under the law. So, that's another thing where some sort of intervention, education, etc., short of throwing the book at them and sending them to juvie, I think is probably a better approach to take because, I just don't think it's a proper place in society to punish people who can't understand what they have done.
And so I know you touched on this, but with with the app ban proposal for notification apps and websites, I know that California is currently considering a full nudify app ban, and I know that the UK criminalized them in January, and the EU is also moving towards an explicit prohibition in their AI Act. So are we finally targeting the right layer of the problem with banning the app layer? Or is banning the apps just a game, a futile game of whack-a-mole? Yeah, what are your thoughts?
Seeing, recognition of the source increasingly of this problem. You're never, I think, going to be able to outlaw all of the locally run AI models that people can tweak locally on their machines, but that's not what kids are using to nudify other kids. It's not necessarily what, by and large, people are using to nudify images of adults. So California does have a first in the nation ban on what they call deepfake pornography services, if memory serves. But we've also seen now that Minnesota, both houses of their legislature passed a law last month. Now I'm talking early May, so this is at the very end of April. I don't know if it's been signed by the governor yet, possibly by now, by the time people are listening to this. Likewise, try and outlaw notification apps. The difficulty there and the difference between those two laws is that California made sure to constrain the law to non-consensual notification. And so they had requirements in place that the site offering it knows that that is what people are using it for and is disregarding the lack of consent by the person who is depicted. Minnesota's law didn't have that. And so they seem to have inadvertently just outlawed AI pornography of real people, which, what I keep saying is the problem with non-consensual deepfake pornography isn't the pornography part, it's the non-consensual part. But the Minnesota law doesn't limit it only to non-consensual uses. Now, in reality, probably 99% of the time, it is non-consensual when somebody's image gets morphed using one of these apps. However, one of the things that we saw in the early days of the Grok situation, before it started getting widely used to non-consensually undress women and girls' images, was that there were adult sex workers who were using Grok kind of as a marketing ploy, a little gimmick to say hey, undress this picture of me, Grok, and it would do that. And that was consensual. And so that sort of puts the lie to the fact that there's going to be some amount that is consensual. And that I think is the real problem for legislating this. And it's where, California tried to put in language that I think is required in order under American law, under our really robust First Amendment, to make sure that you are not just inadvertently sweeping in protected speech in the form of consensual adult pornography. So that's where I think the Minnesota law stumbles and where the California law was at least a little bit better drafted in terms of targeting the services themselves that provide this. I think we'll see, both from the implementation of California's law and from the Take It Down Act, which I'm sure we're going to discuss maybe a little bit more, that federally bans the dissemination of non-consensual intimate images, whether it is deepfake or real, that there is pressure on the sites that provide these kinds of services, along with the fact that payment processors tend to get real scared when it looks like some of their customers may be in violation of the law. So when Take It Down was still being debated last year and hadn't yet quite gotten signed into law, but when the UK and the EU were starting to take measures as well, we saw that one of the platforms for hosting AI models got real nervous about having models available for nudifying real people's images. And they started announcing that those were going to be removed. And one of the most notorious nudification sites online, called Mr. Deepfakes, went offline, completely went dark. And that seemed to be a combination of response to increasing exposure to legal liability as the site itself, rather than just the end user, as well as in the case of the AI model hosting platform, pressure from payment processors. So those things I think are starting to make a difference. But my concern is, like I said, making sure that that the language to try and outlaw the sites themselves is drawn narrowly enough that you have knowledge and intent requirements, rather than just say basically like offering a service for making realistic pornography of real people. That in itself should be protected speech. You have to make sure that it is limited properly. And so I don't know that there have been very many efforts yet to prosecute or take down sites under like California's new law. And I'm not sure what it looks like in the UK or the EU either. We may start seeing, as cases actually start getting brought under those laws, like what do the fact patterns look like? And maybe we will get a better sense of how effective is the mere existence of these sorts of authorities at putting pressure on entities and the payment processors that serve them. One of the interesting things about the California law that I did not see present in the Minnesota law is trying to go another layer down the stack, as it were, to also allow either victims who are depicted or certain public authorities in California to send a notice to services that provide services to nudify apps to tell them, hey, you need to drop this customer within such and such time period, or you yourself will be liable. So that could be things like a cloud hosting service like AWS. It could be something like Cloudflare that provides site protection services. It could be payment processors, right? This makes me very nervous because it is the kind of thing that is pretty common, I think, in the UK, where there is a lot more resort to going to the ISP level to try and get sites taken offline, particularly for copyright infringement purposes. And it's something that makes civil liberties and human rights activists very nervous, because you can make anything illegal under a particular country's laws, and then you can get any sort of site taken offline if it is disfavored. And so my fear with regard to California opening the door to this for nudification, non-consensual deepfake nudification services, the most, unsympathetic possible target, one of them, is that it opens the door to doing something similar in red states to say, we're going to make it illegal, to continue hosting a site that provides accurate information about abortion and how to get, midwifery stone by mail, or accurate information about gender-affirming care, right? Or whatever disfavored topic nowadays. And so that's why I do think that the California law saying, let's go further down the stack, goes a little too far. But I think that's something that we may very well see happen in the UK, because the UK, like I said, has a pretty well-established track record of targeting the ISP level rather than just the site level to try and get sites taken offline under UK law.
Yeah, really interesting. And I do want to get into the Grok issue, because that became a really big mainstream news story. But for our listeners who haven't followed the details on that, can you just give a brief overview of what happened there and what makes Grok structurally different from Nudify apps?
Yeah, sure. So right before New Year's, right at the very end of December of 2025, Elon Musk announced that Grok now would have an image editing function built into the product that's integrated directly into X, formerly known as Twitter. Grok also exists as a standalone app, but now you would be able to basically, if you were an X user, respond to a tweet containing somebody's image and say to Grok, hey, make changes, edit this image to do XYZ. And so people were using it to go into random women's mentions and look at random images of like women, girls, children, and tell Grok, undress this completely innocuous image of a woman, standing next to a Christmas tree. It was Christmas time. And Grok would do that, put her in a bikini, put her in, people came up with increasingly creative prompts to try and get around any of the safeguards that were built in. And then not only would Grok comply, it would also post that image right into the replies. So now all of the people getting victimized by having these images made of them were directly having them pushed in their faces, basically. Whereas it may be the case with making a nudified image with a nudification app that the victim doesn't necessarily know about it at all, doesn't necessarily see it. Here, Grok is basically posting it directly into your replies. Although, of course, it was also able to, respond to prompts for images other than just somebody's image that she had posted directly into her own account, right? So this became very, very widespread for a period of several weeks, leading to international outcry, international investigations. At least two countries temporarily banned Grok in their country, and those sorts of international pressure and investigations seem to be what gradually got X and XAI to make changes to better put more guardrails into Grok to keep it from making nude images or bikinified images of people, was the threat of potential legal consequences and the temporary bans. They really dragged their feet and responded at first by saying, okay, we're only going to limit this image editing feature to paid users, which, like, okay, great. So now you're making money off of users doing this non-consensually to people. It's not actually better. It did seem to stanch some of the biggest flow once it was not just available for free, but nevertheless, even monetizing it was something that they gained a lot of outcry for, quite justifiably. And so eventually they finally said, okay. And they eventually put in, or at least promised to put in, more guardrails against it. And periodically now, several months later, you will still see follow-ups where investigative reporters will still try and say, like, here are still some ways where we're still seeing people try and get around the prompts, or where they themselves were able to creatively get around the prompts. And at the same time, the massive tide of non-consensual deepfaked images of real people, primarily women and some children, does seem to have fallen off quite steeply from the really high pace that it was being created at right around the turn of early January.
Grok is owned by Elon Musk through his company XAI, and one of Elon Musk's big talking points is around free speech and how he doesn't want to be moderating like hate speech on his platform X, and he's gutted the content moderation team there. And I'm wondering whether the sexually explicit imagery that was being generated on Grok was a guardrail failure, or was it a deliberate design choice to allow that? That's now being reframed as an accident.
I mean, it's difficult to say without knowing everything, like, internally within XAI and what instructions were coming from the top versus, what were the motivations of the people building it. So without being able to say specifically, like, it's hard to tell, like, is this just, an intentional issue framed as a design accident? It's certainly, known by now, and certainly by late 2025, that you have to have some amount of guardrails in place to prevent unwanted, types of content from being generated. One of the things that I found interesting about how much XAI dragged their heels on trying to fix this problem with Grok was that it really stood in contrast to when Grok started referring to itself as Mecha Hitler, a year or so before that. They really jumped quite quickly to try and make it stop doing that. And they were a lot slower to try and fix the problem with it, making image-based, abusive images of women and children. But I think you're right to call out the demolition of the content moderation and other, like, trust and safety teams within the company, and that I think it probably made this kind of incident totally unsurprising that it would happen on X, on Grok particularly, as opposed to some of the other major text-to-image generative AI model providers. You're going to get out of it as much as you put into it in terms of safety, and this has always been heavily deprioritized ever since Elon took over Twitter, and seemingly ports the same attitude over into XAI. I mean, a few months before this incident happened, there were postings specifically to try and hire up engineers to work on XAI to make, anime waifu, like, characters. That's, been the use case that they have leaned into much more heavily all along the way. Whether or not, intending to try and be known as the at-scale non-consensual, like, porn machine, XAI in particular has leaned into adult sexual content much more so than the other models out there have been, that seem to have been more about attracting enterprise customers or just generally making themselves more palatable for an eventual IPO, etc. The sorts of brand safety things that Elon seems to have been less concerned with. Now, like I said earlier, the problem with non-consensual deepfake pornography is the non-consensual part, not the pornography part. There's nothing wrong with using AI for creating like adult, like sexual content. But if you pair a deprioritization of, trust and safety functionality with a prioritization of sexual content, then it's not surprising that we get this as the outcome, that it's not just able to make, custom anime girlfriends, it is able to nudify images of real people in real time.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've noticed this, but if you scroll through Elon's like Twitter account, there is a lot. He does repost a lot of like sexually explicit content of women and things like that. So this isn't that surprising to me. But where are we now? Like, has Grok actually stopped producing this content, or has the problem just gone underground?
Um, my understanding is that it is less, but is still happening somewhat. The last update report I saw was there was an NBC News report in like mid-April, and it's currently the first week of May, that was still finding AI generated images, sexualized images and videos of real people. Both, like you mentioned, posted to Musk's own account, as well as images that Grok was still making, but it seems like the number has decreased significantly. They don't seem to be making images of children anymore, which Elon denied was ever happening, although there were 20 or so thousand images of children that researchers had managed to find. And it seems like there are more guardrails in place against some of the more overt attempts to undress people's images, but nevertheless that there are still some ways to try and make at least, suggestive, or erotic images of people, whether or not they are fully nude now. And, this is something that is going to continue being exploited because there are communities of users who are very, very dedicated to trying to get around the guardrails and come up with creative ways to continue making the imagery that, now, after a lot of public outcry, after being banned in 2 countries temporarily, XAI's engineers have been trying to do to try and keep it from generating really explicit images. But because there are like communities of people trying to circumvent the guardrails intentionally and then sharing what they learn like with each other, this is something that seems like it will only continue to keep going. And, I'll just sort of say what I thought, like right at the beginning, it just seemed like the best thing to do once this got rolled out in late December and was immediately getting misused at such massive scale. The proper thing to do wasn't to drag your heels and say, well, we're going to only restrict it to, paid users and blah, blah, blah. Just turn it off. If you have a feature that is going so badly wrong and it is getting used for so much harm for very little benefit, just turn it back off again. I don't know that you could compel them to turn it off. Maybe in Malaysia, like that was being one of the countries that banned it. But in the United States, I don't think you can force a company to turn off their image generator. But just as a matter of protecting, the company's own brand and making it more attractive to users, to investors, to business users, etc., it just seemed like, the harms were outweighing the benefits, and the brand harm was outweighing the brand benefit. But this has just been such a popular use case, and users are so motivated to continue stripping the guardrails and circumventing the guardrails from it, that it seems like there's probably just going to be a constant trickle of this going on. What I do think might happen sometime this year is that we may see what will happen with the at least 3 different lawsuits that have been filed in US courts against XAI and against X for the nudification incidents around the turn of the year. So there's been both an individual lawsuit filed by Ashley St. Clair, who claims to be one of his baby mamas, whose image was being manipulated as an adult, not as a child. And then there are 2 separate class actions, one involving children whose images were allegedly made into sexual deepfakes using Grok, and one of adults. And so we'll see what will happen with the rulings in those cases, whether any of them might end up settling. If there's a settlement, there might be a range of options on the table for making particular changes to the Grok product. And if they want to fight it all the way through court, which Elon is extremely litigious, if nothing else, he's very litigious, and so might not be inclined to settle. We'll see what the courts have to say. That will probably take a while. Litigation takes a very long time. I'm a former litigator, mostly in federal court. This stuff can take years if it doesn't settle quickly. Any other company might be incentivized to try and sell this quickly because it is a really, really bad look PR-wise. But Elon is the richest man in the world. He loves, fighting in court. He's in trial right now with OpenAI as we speak. And so it is hard to see that we might get a prompt resolution, pun intended, in these class action cases very soon. But that might show us what the range of legal remedies are under the law to try and make product changes that might not necessarily be more directly, something that could be more directly compelled to get taken offline or otherwise make changes merely by law. So we'll see.
Yeah. Yeah, and you talked about the the bad PR that this is attracting to X. But I wonder whether the thing that all PR, all publicity is good publicity. And maybe they the financial incentives behind this, the fact that if people can go to Grok and generate intimate imagery, that's driving a lot of engagement to Grok.
Yes.
And there are probably perverse incentives where it's acting against their own financial interests to try to regulate or to put guardrails around this.
Yeah, I mean, right. This is, again, not only is it unsurprising that this came out of XAI in particular, just as a company that had fewer guardrails, fewer, safety preventions in place, more willingness to lean into sexual content, but also to see that the response to it has been just more divorce guy, oppositional defiance disorder, energy, and trying to lean into this. Again, the richest guy in the world doesn't necessarily have to care what, good PR or bad PR looks like. He can lean into saying, great, I can have an entire community of degenerates that flock to my app once it becomes known as a potential source for this. You can drive signups they saw, you saw, they were unafraid to use this as a moment to try and drive more paid signups, more paid subscriptions by luring that, dangling that to users, oh, we're going to make this restricted now, this functionality from free users. And they were literally prompting people in, trying to use Grok that way to sign up for a paid subscription. So I think, you're definitely right that he is a standout in terms of the branding, the sort of general stance of this company compared to others, which does make me think, people would ask me don't you think this is just going to spread to other generative AI, model providers if they learn that they can kind of get away with this? And, nothing that bad happened in the United States. We've seen the lawsuits I mentioned. There are investigations by multiple state attorneys general, but nothing really happened at the federal government level because he is very good friends also with the US federal government. He led DOJ for a long time. He has close ties to the US federal government. So nothing seemed to really be happening. And so I got asked, isn't that going to teach everybody else that they can also similarly get away with it? And what I said was, I don't think every other big text to image generative AI company out there has the same appetite for this kind of brand positioning that XAI does under Elon Musk. OpenAI wants to go public. Anthropic positions itself as the most, ethical of and they don't even have an image generator, right? So I don't think that other companies are taking that lesson away. I think we're seeing that this is sort of an anomalous, this is another Elon thing, and that is just the company culture there. And so it may be up to seeing what happens with the investigations happening at the state level all around the world, what exactly will happen to try and bring this to heel if they continue to say we want to lean into the edgelord type of branding that he has always used.
Yeah. And yeah, just a few questions left to wrap up. But I do want to talk about the penalties actually facing XAI, because as you've said, in the US, they haven't faced much, they haven't really gotten much of a punishment for this. That's remotely proportionate to what happened. And I know that individual users who post deepfake images can be prosecuted under Take It Down. But the fact that Grok itself, the platform that produced this tool and enabled all of this, is not facing any punishment. Like, are other countries prosecuting this? Like, what is the ultimate result of this for Grok?
So I don't know what the status is of the investigations in other countries. I know a while back there was a raid on X's offices in France by the Paris prosecutor. And so I don't know what's happening there. Are there going to be criminal charges? What's happening? The countries that had temporarily banned Grok lifted the ban once XAI promised to make changes. And so that seems like, a pretty heavy-handed, type of remedy to bring into play, and something that maybe they wouldn't be afraid to bring the ban hammer down again if that were to be another issue. We will see, I think, what happens both with these lawsuits that I mentioned that may, I think we can expect maybe at least some rulings this year to try and say like what sort of liability exposure does XAI and X like collectively have for their image generator being used in this way. And we'll also see what starts to happen when the Take It Down Act's takedown provisions go into effect just a couple of weeks from when we are recording. When the Take It Down Act was passed in May of 2025, it didn't just criminalize the non-consensual dissemination of intimate imagery, whether real or a deepfake. It also included provisions requiring that platforms take down images when reported by a user on request very promptly within 48 hours. That's very fast. But recognizing that it would take some time to build out compliance mechanisms for processing, like processing these reports and then actually complying with them and removing the images, Congress gave platforms a year to get that done. So that year is just about up. And so in mid-May of 2026, we are about to see the Take It Down Act's actual backronym takedown provisions come into effect. And so then, given the stiff penalties for not complying with the takedown requirements, that should serve as a pretty major incentive for X to start promptly removing these images. Of course, that does still put the onus on the victim themselves to file those reports to get imagery taken down. It doesn't necessarily address the inherent capacity of Grok to keep making those images. Of course, seems to me the easiest way to avoid having to take down those sorts of images is, like I said, to just like disable the image editing feature that keeps getting misused in Grok this way, as just integrated directly into X, the Everything app. So we will see what that compliance looks like. My hope is that platforms, including X, but including all of the other social media, etc. platforms out there too that are covered by Take It Down, will start publishing transparency reports that include statistics about the Take It Down Act requests that they receive and what percentage they comply with. There's been a lot of concern that the prompt 48-hour takedown period combined with the stiff penalties is wide open to abuse. President Trump promised to use it to take down content about himself that he didn't like, not necessarily sexual content, just critical commentary about him when he signed it into law last year. So it may be misused to get imagery taken down that doesn't actually qualify as a sexually explicit image underneath the law. In fact, a lot of the bikini pictures probably wouldn't qualify for being taken down because they require, display of nude, like intimate body parts, rather than just images of somebody in a swimsuit, for example. So I think it's also going to be open question. Both how will users want to get imagery taken down of them that may be sexually suggestive or, may be humiliating to them, but doesn't necessarily actually qualify as the types of nude imagery that the law covers, or other sexualized imagery that the law actually covers. And then what will platforms do? Will they just try and take that material down anyway because they don't want to get into a fight over it, or because they believe in the inherent dignity of people might just as a matter of policy extend to non-consensual bikini images just as much as to nude imagery? We're gonna see. So that, I think, is going to be coming up very soon, and hopefully within a few months we will be able to start seeing in early days how are different platforms dealing with their takedown obligations and how are they and to what extent are they going beyond the actual strictures, the actual base requirements of the law? Again, we've been talking about Elon trying to lean in a more pro-free speech direction. We will see whether they only decide to take down within the exact precise letter of the law, or will they also still have incentives to take down anything that gets reported to avoid even the possibility of the really high fines that the law can impose on providers for not complying with their takedown obligations.
And to wrap up, so there's obviously been a lot of progress made, laws being passed around the world regarding this issue, and rightly so because it's become a big problem. So what's your just overall, like, your outlook on where we are right now and what needs to get done in the future in regards to this issue?
I think that even just having this federal law, I would like to see the takedown provisions tightened up so that they are less susceptible to abuse. I don't think we should wait to see a bunch of perfectly lawful and non-sexually explicit speech get taken down because platforms are just more afraid of getting handed a bunch of fines than they are of over removing user speech. I would like to see the last few states that have not yet clearly outlawed AI-generated CSAM, like of real kids, clearly do so in their laws. And like I think I've been saying, I think a big gap that is up next is what to do about kids as offenders. When we interviewed state lawmakers and their staffs who had sponsored bills to outlaw AI-CSAM at the state level, they told us that the student-on-student fact pattern just wasn't on their radar at all. They were thinking about children as victims, not as offenders. And so I think the next level, now that we have a fairly uniform ban against using AI to make sexually explicit images of real kids at the state level all over the country, as well as at the federal level. The next level, I think, will be trying to decide what to do about kids as offenders in order to avoid traumatizing more kids, like I was saying earlier. I think the next thing will also be for states to clarify their mandatory reporter laws to make sure that this is on the radar of schools, to know what to do about that in the event that they have a deepfake nude incident in their schools, and also to think about whether states should add image-based sexual abuse as a form of cyberbullying to their state cyberbullying laws that already require states to have, schools to have a cyberbullying policy in place that would force them to be thinking about this and have a policy for image-based sexual abuse, whether it's circulation of real nude images or of non-consensual deepfakes. So those are the next steps that I think we could see, at least in the United States.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. This was a really insightful conversation. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DeepFake Dialogues. If you found this conversation insightful, please follow and leave us a review. It really helps get the word out. See you in the next episode.